So in the last day or two, Gina Raimondo has said America's tech sanctions on China are non-negotiable. She said this in a meeting with high-level Chinese officials. Now, sanctions were first imposed onto a Chinese company, Huawei, in 2019 under the Donald Trump administration. And he added Huawei to an entity list, which is a trade blacklist maintained by the US Department of Commerce. And the key reasons that America gave for this was national security and allegations that Huawei's technology might be used by the Chinese government for espionage. But I think the reality is that they did it because Huawei, who are one of China's largest tech companies, they're China's crown jewel, so to speak. Their technology was evolving much faster than that of US companies, especially in the telecoms sector. In fact, they hold more patents in 5G than any other company in the world. They were one of the pioneers of 5G technology. Other players involved, the Baltic countries, Nordic countries, Sweden and Ericsson, and then Samsung of Korea. But basically the US didn't have any company that was involved in 5G, and this was causing them a problem. And then further sanctions were applied in August 2020, and basically they expanded that entity list of sanctions to 38 additional Huawei affiliates across 21 countries. And basically it meant that any company that was using American technology to either manufacture or in the process of manufacture needed to obtain a license from the US in order to sell things to China. And many of those licenses were not granted. So it prevented Huawei from buying semiconductors from the world's biggest foundry, which is TSMC in Taiwan. And then when Trump lost the election and Biden got elected, Biden actually continued with the sanctions, and he actually imposed further sanctions in 2004 by revoking a lot of the export licenses that had been previously granted under the Trump administration. And those previous licenses allowed companies like Intel and Qualcomm and Nvidia to sell chips to Huawei. Now, Huawei have no problem in designing chips. They have a very robust semiconductor unit called high silicon, but there is a problem in the manufacture of those. And this has led, really, what the US have done here is they've forced the hand of many Chinese companies. So what you've got now is companies all over China are actually looking to get American components out of their supply chains because they are either worried they will be next on the entity list or they will be sanctioned. But actually, the US policy is causing a lot of issues for semiconductor companies in the USA. As China's by far the biggest market of semiconductors in the world, and in recent years China spent more money on semiconductors than it does on oil imports. And China either uses the vast majority of semiconductors, or as it's the world's largest producer of electronic goods, it uses those semiconductors in finished goods, because actually nowadays semiconductors are contained in almost everything: televisions, coffee machines, mobile phones, lots and lots of electronic gadgets, all sorts of things. So what the US has actually done by putting these sanctions is actually limited the business of companies like Nvidia, Intel, AMD, Qualcomm in the Chinese market. And so they used to depend on the Chinese market for a significant amount of their revenue, and they're finding that more and more difficult now because they're not allowed to sell into the Chinese market. But this has a knock-on effect. It means because their revenues are lower, they have less money to invest in R&D. More and more Chinese companies are now using local suppliers. Previously they were more than happy to buy from American companies because the products were tried and tested. And a lot of Chinese local domestic companies didn't really get a look in. They found it hard to penetrate the market. But that's all changing now. This is actually having a massive benefit now to Chinese suppliers because they are getting more revenue, they have more money to invest in R&D, and they're progressing much, much faster. And many Chinese companies are now innovating at breakneck speed. So you had Huawei, they brought out a phone about a year ago which had got 7 nanometer chip technology in, something that the West thought couldn't be done. They've now got Ascend chips which are equal in ability to NVIDIA's H100, which is the chip that they're allowed to sell into the Chinese market. It's kind of a slower version of their flagship semiconductor. And so many Chinese companies are now using Huawei Ascend chips for their AI, and that includes companies like China Telecom and ByteDance. So effectively, the US has really hobbled NVIDIA because NVIDIA had a monopolistic position with their AI chips, because they had a software stack called CUDA, and CUDA was very, very dominant. There was no challenges to CUDA. But what the US sanctions have done now is they've actually created a competitor to CUDA in the form of Mindspore, which is Huawei's software stack to support its Ascend AI chips. And China has no issue in designing chips. In fact, Huawei have a very capable semiconductor development unit called HiSilica. And they have no problem designing chips, but the bottleneck and the problem is manufacturing chips, because the sanctions have cut off China from a very important company called ANSL. It's a Dutch company, and they're the only company in the world that currently produces machines that can do the lithography for these semiconductors, these advanced semiconductors, sort of 7 nanometers and below. And China have had their access denied to those machines because they use American technology. Now, China are working very fast to solve this manufacturing problem. It's this one particular bottleneck that they can't do lithography at much lower than 7 nanometers. They can do it at 7 nanometers, although the yields they may be getting are not as good as if they were using EUV machines. They are using DUV machines to do that. Again, these are ASL machines. However, things are moving very, very quickly, and there's a lot of companies working on it. If you look at just Huawei alone, they've just opened a new research facility, R&D facility in Shanghai. And they will be staffing that with 30,000 R&D engineers. And rumour has it that they're actually paying above the market rates to get the right people. Now, Huawei already pay very handsome salaries indeed, probably one of the best payers in China of salary for the tech industry. But as I say, they're getting a huge amount of smart people. One of the remits of that R&D centre is to research and overcome this problem with lithography. And also, if you look at China graduates each year around 8 or 9 times more graduates in the STEM subjects, which is science, technology, maths and engineering, than America do. So they have a massive pool to draw from. And not only that, if you look at the Nature ranking now for universities that are filing the most research papers, or the quality of research papers they're filing, China actually has 8 or 9 out of the top 10 universities now in that Nature's top 10 list. But this is having huge effects on the American semiconductor designers and manufacturers. We've just seen Intel are going to lay off around 15,000 people. They were also planning to build a new semiconductor fabrication plant in Germany. That's now been put on hold for 2 years, which probably means it's been cancelled. The semiconductor plant that TSMC were pretty much forced to build in the US is years behind schedule. Intel are having difficulty with some of their new technology to make smaller chips, and it's already been said by people at TSMC that semiconductors coming out of the American plants will be 30 to 40% higher in price than what comes out of their Taiwanese plants. You also have to remember that a lot of these plants around the world, they actually use the silicon wafers, which is the bare material for the chips. And those silicon wafers, a majority of them are manufactured in China. So if China wanted to, it could really cause big disruption in the semiconductor industry by just limiting the supply of those blank wafers. No other country in the world has the processing and refining techniques and supply chain to be able to get up and running in a short space of time. So China really are in a good position in a sense that once they've cracked this technology of lithography, they will absolutely be storming it, because already you see that in legacy node chips, which is sort of 24 nanometer and above, China are actually ramping up production like there's no tomorrow. They're absolutely nailing it, and their semiconductor sort of market share is growing very, very rapidly, and it will continue to grow rapidly over the next few years. What's also quite amazing is that the US not only hobbling themselves their own semiconductor manufacturers and designers, they're also trying to get other countries in on the game. I've already mentioned ASML in Holland. The outgoing CEO, Peter Wenick, was very critical of the action the US is taking. He knows that all the action will do is create another competitor for their machines in the future. But the US are trying to drag Japan and Korea into the thing. Right now, China buys a lot of memory, high bandwidth memory from South Korea, and I think around half of South Korea's exports go into the Chinese market. So it's like the US are asking Korea and Japan to destroy their businesses as well by not selling to China. Now, Japan and Korea did impose some sanctions under arm twisting from the US, but on this latest round, it seems as though Korea and Japan are somewhat pushing back against the America's narrative. So we'll wait to see what happens there. I think once the China break the bottleneck of this lithography and they can manufacture these, higher end chips, these smaller than 5 nanometer chips, I really think the US is going to have serious problems, because when China manufactures, they scale up on a huge scale, and they will make those chips at extremely competitive prices. So you will have two chips the same. This one's made in the US and costs $100. This one's made in China and costs $60. Which one do you think the customer's going to buy? I know which one I would buy, regardless of whether it's made in America or in China. If it does the same job, I'm going to buy the $60 one, because then I'll be more competitive, or I'll make more profit in my market. And that's just business sense. I actually think the US have made a huge mistake. I think they will cut off the market. As I mentioned before, China is by far the largest semiconductor market in the world. There's no way that those companies in America are going to find alternative customers to replace China. And once China crack, the manufacturing process, then I think the semiconductor will suffer severely in the US. I really think the US have shot themselves in the foot with this policy, and I think they will actually live to regret it. But I would really like to know what you think down in the comments. I think it's a very interesting topic. I will keep covering it. There'll be more videos on this channel about it. But as always, for now, take care.